of relays under our researchers practice program. It was earlier scheduled for February, but had to be postponed. But here we are with David and Annapurna. So for those joining us for the first time, this second set of relays under researchers practice program are thematized under crafting thought and are anchored and conceptualized by art historian, designer Annapurna Garimella. It has been wonderful working with her. Thank you, Annapurna, for generously accepting our invitation and conceiving this amazing sessions. So all the previous sessions have been archived under our YouTube channel. So please feel free to browse and listen in at your own pace. We're very excited to have David with us today, who's joining us from London. He's an artist, designer, writer, and publisher, and with his multimedia and multidisciplinary practice, he'll open up six aspects of his activities today. And the format of today's session is going to be very different from what we have explored and done so far. So I'm very thrilled and excited to see how it will unfold. So without taking much time, I'm going to pass it on to Annapurna to take over and take us through what she has in plan for us. Over to you, Annapurna.
Thank you so much, Akanksha. I am so happy that this session is finally happening. For the audience of today's session, they will be posting David's biography in the chat session. I request all of you to post any questions or hop on in and ask questions directly after we're done with the presentation. This presentation is structured in such a way, and this is both something that David wanted and something that I was game for, where he presents and I have my own interventions in between, unlike a straight conversation that the first two were, first the presenters put forward their ideas and their thought and their work. And then we had a conversation. Annapurna Mamidipudi wanted me to present something of my own thoughts and ideas and my own biographical sketch, I suppose, in order to launch hers. And today I responded to David's presentation by inserting some slides of my own, and in between I will interject and say things, and then he can respond to them, or he can say I don't know, or he can say let's talk about this further on. All these things are possible. So let me, I've been each session, I have been, I'm sorry, you'll have to bear with me as the electricity goes in and out. The internet will continue, but my face won't be visible sometimes because of we have a thunderstorm happening here in Hyderabad. And so the electricity is going off. So we have, I became interested in having David as the first person to speak because many years ago, I purchased a book that he will discuss today called Living Pictures, which is a perspectives on the film poster in India. And that book was interesting to me because he's a person who is not so much part of the cinema studies world or the popular art or photography scholarship world. And here was this person that decided to step in and engage with this very popular art form in southern India, where he has often lived and worked. And then when you open it to the table of contents, there's many people who come from scholarly backgrounds, M.S.S. Pandian, Chris Penny, Sarah Dickey, and others. So I was curious about this person who has taken pictures, who didn't just want to take pictures and show them in a gallery, but he made a book. And this book had very good design that was in some way true, or not true wouldn't be the correct word, but in some way deeply respectful of the context in which film posters emerge from, their graphic design quality, but of course also true to his own endeavor. I was also very interested in the fact that he's interested in having a conversation with scholars, some of them were known to write sometimes in rather difficult theoretical ways. And then I got this library for this book for our library at the trust that I run. And then I myself changed over those years, because if you run a library, you're around books all the time. And of course I teach and I write and I design and I look at the way books are made and how the making of a book encapsulates ideas. And the book is itself a crafting of thought. And then lo and behold, I looked up, for some reason, came into contact with David's website. The website is called openeditions.com, and I'm sure that's also going to be posted in the chat box. So I saw these books, and these books are also what David will talk about. And I was totally fascinated by the topic of these books. The titles of these books: Specialism, Self-Organized, Curating Subjects, Curating and the Educational Turn, Distributed. They're very specific. They speak to a world I'm not completely apart from, but I'm not comfortably situated in either, which is the contemporary art world and the contemporary art pedagogy world. And but rather than augmenting anxiety or diminishing it, I found that when I ordered these books and they came, they actually did what I want to do, which is to open up questions and to stage genuine, deep conversations between various people. They're not all, another thing I love about this series of publications and the other ones on the open editions, they're not all involving David as a writer. They have, or as an editor, there are other people who do this. And that kind of spirit of publicly shared platforms. You make beautiful things so other people can be there. To me, is part of crafting thought. So here was these books that to me represented the core of what I consider to be my intellectual and emotional work in my profession, in my scholarly life, in my teaching, which is how do we craft thought? And these books represent that. So I wanted him to be the first speaker. And when I reached out to him, of course, even after that, I reached out to him once and I said, I want you to come and I want you to do something with me in India. And I've never met David in person. It's always been online and in these text message conversations. And I'm very grateful to Kanksha to make even this level of connection possible. I want you to come and do. Then of course, COVID happened and that went into the freezer, back burner, so to speak. It will happen, but it will take a little bit of time. So, when I was asked to do this, I wanted him to come and present his ideas and his thoughts and his work and how he thinks about all of these things. And he calls himself, I think, a polymath. And I like that idea. But for me, being a polymath doesn't mean that you are jack of all trades. But what it means is you think deeply about many things, and maybe the connection between all of them is deep thought and a method of thinking through things. So I invite David to start, and please be patient with me if I cannot immediately respond because if there's a problem with the internet or the electricity. We just move forward and deal with things as they come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annapurna. I'll try and share the screen. I hope that's visible to everybody.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So maybe, thank you for that very generous introduction. Yeah, I sensed we were kindred spirits. Your very first email. So let's hope we still get along together after this session, because I really hope to come and meet you in person. Yeah. So Annapurna chose the 6 facets of my practice. So I followed her lead. If I had been left to my own devices, I may have picked 3 or 11 or different ones. So there's a kind of connection to India where you are in a lot of the work, which I'm happy to follow that pathway. And so they may seem disparate, these 6 facets, but hopefully during the course of our conversation and my description of what's going on, we'll be able to make, if not just loose associations between them, but strong bonds. And then maybe just the other little caveat before, yes, another structural issue is Annapurna was really keen that I read something from my PhD thesis, which made me tremble in a cold sweat, because I don't want you to get bored that much. But there is an aspect of my PhD research which is very accessible, somewhat poetic, and provocative in a gentle way. And so before each of the 6 sections, I'm going to read a short passage of text for you that may seem like non sequiturs or apropos of nothing, but that's okay. We might find some loose associations between those as well. And then finally, I think Annapurna's sort of come close to saying this, but my perspective here today is as a practitioner. So I'm a professional artist. I run a publishing company and I teach, but I'm not an academic. I'm not a theorist, but I do put my toe in those pools from time to time. So I'm just going to, there's an acknowledgement of the way we're working for Annapurna. And this is the first text from my PhD. The image you're looking at is an installation by the American artist called Bruce Nauman. And it's called Natural Light, Blue Light Room. And it was made in 1971. A few years ago, when I taught at the Royal College of Art in London, a bunch of students and I set something up called the Critical Forum Programme. Our intention initially was to look at our work sideways, so to speak, through the lens of art theory and the efforts of others. The scheme worked well, but after a while, we switched back to interrogating our own studio practices, albeit while remaining attentive to critical contexts. This work was extremely demanding, but equally rewarding. At the end of teaching days, everybody went home feeling like they'd achieved something worthwhile. In fact, we'd often delay the moment of departure by lingering in the classroom in semi-silence. We had a nice west-facing space to work in with high ceilings and big bay windows on the ground floor of a grand stucco building on Queensgate. At sunset, we'd get these amazing skies over Kensington High Street. Salmon and mandarin light would radiate into the room and merge with the cool glow emanating from the idle blue screen of the data projector. It was just perfect. Drained, sitting with friends, and floating in that duotone cloud of complementary light. So this brings us on to the first section, which is about teaching and learning. My story in education is kind of unusual because I studied design at BA and MA level at the Royal College. But after I graduated from the Royal College, I migrated to fine art. And it took me quite a long time to do that, because in the late 1980s, the gatekeepers to the art world held a lot of power, and it was almost impossible to make that sort of transition. And the way I did it was through publishing, actually. I'd been making what would be termed artists' books, so small editions of books that operated as mini linear technologies for works of art. So the book object and the way one read such an object was an integrated art experience. It was intended to be very different to the kind of reading experience you would have if you were reading Gombrich or John le Carré or New Scientist magazine or the New Yorker. Artist books were supposed to be alarming, sensational, poetic, indecipherable mood shifters. And I was very interested in the history of contemporary artists that had worked making their own books and also making paintings that looked like graphic design. People like Ed Ruscha or Dieter Roth, for example. So I used the book as a bridge from design to art, basically. And so that's the story of my migration. But at the same time, another oddity is that I've always taught simultaneously on design and fine art courses all the way through my career. And now my PhD's in fine art, and I feel really comfortable traversing the boundary between the two spheres. So to cut a long story short, because I'm presuming the length of this talk is more like a Hollywood than a Bollywood movie, so I'm gonna keep it moving along. I taught at the Royal College almost since I graduated as a part-time teacher, and I left my job there 3 years ago and set up an education platform called Total Art School. And the bad news was that COVID coincided exactly with the same week almost that we launched this project. So it's been a bit of a stillborn baby in many ways. But we've done a few things with universities online abroad in China and Finland. And our Instagram account, we've tried to be quite active, commissioning writers to participate in a book review project. I think it's called On the Shelf or Off the Shelf, I can't remember. So you can see some of that work by just checking out the Instagram account. Now, Total Art School, the name, it comes from the 70s idea of total art, which is a kind of art form that combines theatre with gallery exhibitions and happenings and graphics. So it's an integrated form of art, which I guess has its roots in the Bauhaus. And this was my inspiration because I've always felt the foundation course of my art education was my most enjoyable period, and that students should have the freedom to talk to whoever they want. And it's quite logical that maybe a gardener would have an influence on a sculptor, or a nuclear scientist might have something worthwhile to say to someone working in programming software, for example. So the ethos of the Total Art School project is very much in line with the way that I published the books that Annapurna referred to, is that I want to coalesce a group of people around an idea that have similar feelings and come from different backgrounds. So we don't necessarily agree with each other, but we're working in what would be called an interdisciplinary way. And if you look at the website, because I was full of emotion about this project 3 years ago when it was going to be launched, I haven't actually looked at it for quite a while. But it forced me into thinking, repositioning my thinking about education completely and my role as a teacher in art schools. And I kind of concluded that the terms and conditions that are prevalent in the UK at the moment were no longer satisfactory to me. And I lost faith. I lost my faith, like a Catholic may stop believing in God. But rather than just feel depressed and go and do something else, I thought I'd like to try and do something positive to correct this. So some of these paragraphs kind of outline the ethos that I would like to work with. And I might read a couple of them for you just to talk about, because one of them leads directly from one of the books that we published. So Total Art School explodes conventional teaching models where techniques such as printmaking, programming, or painting, for example, are isolated disciplinary categories. Instead, we frame our occupations around modes of distribution. All our work pivots on the ways and means by which our creativity is expected to function in the world, whether you wish to engage with your audience via performance, like this is performance, broadcast, so if I release a bit of music on Bandcamp, or I play something I've made on the radio, that's broadcast, or my film is screened on the television. Publication would be the books, or exhibition is showing anything in a space that's designated as a point of close scrutiny and contemplation for an art audience. Our pursuits are unlimited by conventional educational pathways. So this was my silver bullet idea. This was the result of 30 years of teaching, is that I thought wouldn't it just be such an amazing idea to just sort of reorganize art schools completely and just drag everything away from the chains of materials and processes and just make it about ideas and how those ideas reach audiences. Now, I know this is the last slide on this subject, so Annapurna, if you want to respond to that before I move on.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. Actually, 3 things I'd like you to talk about.
Yep.
But I'll save one for later. One is, why do you like to teach? What does teaching do for you in terms of helping you? How do you craft teaching as a form of thinking?
Yeah, okay, that's right now I don't actually want to teach anymore. I mean, I'm less enamored with it now than I was, because unfortunately I've lived through a golden era of teaching in art school, and I believe very strongly that education, like healthcare, is a social responsibility and not a commercial opportunity. So the monetarization of education in the UK leaves graduates with huge debt before they even get into the workplace. And this is something politically that I'm really against. And that's just one example of many changes that have happened incrementally. over recent years that I'm diametrically opposed to. So I got to the point where I just had to admit that I didn't want to be associated with that anymore. And so I stopped. But as the text alluded to, I hope, that I read at the beginning about that teaching experience where we were bathing in the sunset and the blue screen light, I've had some of the happiest, most productive teaching and learning experiences in my life in the classroom. So at its best, when it's a democratic, non-hierarchical environment with no assessment and plenty of time around every event, and you can generate a relationship of collaboration and collegial equality between teachers and students. It's just so satisfying to see students gain confidence to be learning for themselves. So that moment that you can arrive at, given time, at MA level, when the student no longer needs you anymore, that redundancy is actually the high point, you know. And so I love that so much. And then, of course, I just really like young people, and I'm interested to hear what people are thinking about. So the kind of teaching that I like involves listening as much as speaking. So it's not a broadcast style of teaching I'm interested in at all. It's much more democratic and involves a lot of silence and listening alongside more formal presentations.
Do you challenge students in teaching?
I do have a reputation for being very honest and direct. I think in the past, when I was younger, I was too quick to use that tool on occasion. But so I'm much more sensitive about that now, because I'm more aware of mental health in educational environments, and so it's non-productive nowadays, I think, to be cut too close to the bone, or be to just be aware of of the damage that such a form of criticism could take. You have to be very careful to keep it constructive, but also equally careful not to be lazy and just approve of everything all the time, because it's easier for the system to work if there's no dissent. So yeah, the question of where criticality is in art education in the UK at the moment is actually a hot question for lots of reasons, and we could have a separate seminar about it. So there is a view that a kind of politically correct dogma, or certain fashions even in intellectual life and research particularly, dominate the environment so much that anyone that deviates from that line of thought is afraid to speak their own mind. Now, I've been out of the situation for a while, so I haven't experienced the full force of what I've heard about there, but I've certainly detected the beginnings of that. And that's not the democracy I'm talking about, or I aspire to. There are people that think that art schools have become non-critical environments. I think it's a good debate to have, and we could talk about that further. I hope it's not true.
I think sometimes both things are true, rather than one or the other. There's probably too much criticality of a certain dogmatic kind, and not enough criticality that is more, has some sort of cognitive justice involved in open overall criticality, right? Like really examining everything.
Like
the second thing I
holistic-
wanted to ask you about is actually, yeah, maybe holistic is the word, or maybe just that everybody has to eat criticality pie every so often,
Yeah.
and all kinds of flavors and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question I wanted to ask you was about the website page, and you talked about emotion. And I really like an artist and a man particularly who comes forward and begins to talk about emotion. So can you talk a little bit about how emotion is connected to the way you form your thinking? It's really important. So much of, weirdly, I find so much of art practice and teaching and writing is afraid of emotion. So if you could sort of cogitate on that a little bit, that would be nice.
Okay. Well, because formally my work as an artist looks quite minimal and has a conceptual element, it's really important for me to evidence my emotional self in that work. And actually, I'm really suspicious of robots and automation and a lot of aspects of digital life that are terribly unemotional, in an obvious way, because so I think in fine art there's this tension between expressionism and conceptualism, so maybe it would help us locate the question in a dialectic as simple as that. My favorite kind of conceptualism is the kind that's expressive. It has both. So it goes back to your point about being holistic. I don't think hard minimalism is that interesting at all, a load of monochromatic work made by middle-aged men. It only became interesting to me after feminism, when arte povera emerged and people were able to talk about materials in a non-masculine way, or talk about materials in a poetic way or an emotional way, or to reintroduce the question, which is something I'm completely focused on in my PhD work, is when you look at this or that piece of work, how does it make you feel? Not just how much do you think it's worth, or how far will my career be furthered by this, or how did you make it? I think the question about the receiver's feelings after the encounter with the work of art is something we can think about a lot more.
That's a wonderful response. Shall we move to the next slide?
Sure. I can't remember what this section's about, so I'm just going to read the text first and then we'll get to it. This is a piece of work that was commissioned by Tate Modern in London, and it's by the artist Olafur Eliasson, who works in Berlin, and it's called The Weather Project, and it was staged in 2003. In behavioral science, groups of individuals are often studied to see how indirect suggestions are used as ways to influence decision-making. As I stooped to lie down on the cold floor of the turbine hall at Tate Modern, I marveled at how I'd been stage managed into thinking that Olafur Eliasson's conjunction of a semicircular screen, mirrors, and artificial mist could create anything but the illusion of a sun. And yet, here I was arranging my jacket as though it was a beach towel and seriously considering removing my socks and shoes. All around, groups of people sat in silence, facing the same direction as me, towards the full star. Some looked as though they'd just left a club on Sunday lunchtime to ride their come-downs out in the park. Others gave the impression that they were in their back gardens, entertaining friends. I, however, had just body surfed a nice wave up onto Galgibarga Beach. At the last moment, I'd used the waning momentum of the wave to flip forwards underwater and walk straight out of the shallows onto the sand. No need for a towel after all. I'll just dry myself right here in the light. So it's the publishing section. I think you raised a bit of a question in your introduction about this series. So I'll start with that. And it's about the ethos again of the editorial vision. And you're quite right. I was very keen to organize a bar fight, I suppose. That I would invite people, stakeholders in an idea who didn't necessarily have the same opinion, to come together and exchange ideas. So all the books in these series, none of the books in these series tell the reader what to think. They rather awkwardly and messily sometimes, because they mix writing by artists with writing by historians, writing by academics. So stylistically, they're kind of awkward. But if you're prepared to soldier on and read all the way through, I think the ideas present themselves in the fullness of the reading experience. But the texture of the individual chapters is kind of unusual because they're quite different. Sometimes I literally position two chapters that might be about the same subject where the writers completely disagree with each other. And the other thing about these books is I don't ever have to do one unless I feel like it. So it's sort of my job, but it's not like a job. The publishing company, people think it's huge because we distribute them all over the world in quite big numbers. But it's this room behind me. I'm it. This is it. And so I kind of organize a party around every idea. So if I get proposals for books a lot, and they're often not right. But occasionally someone will send me a proposal that will catch my imagination, and I'll think, God damn it, that's exactly something we should be thinking about right now. So let's do it. And then I'll enter into a relationship with that person who will become the editor. And I'm the series editor. So I'm kind of I'm like a kind of midwife, if you like, for the book. And the editor's the mother of the book. And so whoever's editing has full responsibility to select their writers and decide what kind of shape the anthology is going to take. I will read the script and I'll read the texts. And if there's something that doesn't look right, or if something's weak, I will offer my opinion, and maybe something will be rejected or deleted. Or if there's something missing, if there's an angle missing that's not been addressed, I might point that out. So I sort of work as a critical friend a little bit as well. But the editor, once I've decided I trust them, I'll back them, all the way to publication. And I've had a very good relationship with Paul O'Neill, who edited with Mick Wilson, the bottom three on the image there. And we might be doing a new one with Paul quite shortly, with an even more provocative and truncated title than the ones that we've used so far. And I've done a couple myself that I've been involved in, and I'll talk about those in a minute after you've presented some of your own thoughts, perhaps.
Well, you know, when I look at your books, both your Living Pictures book as well as these books, inevitably I feel a couple of things. One is that there's a history of publication that is quite provocative publication by artists and art critics that stages a debate in the book format. And your books participate in that lineage. And I of course put this book Ways of Seeing here because not only is it from the UK, it's one of the early predecessors for this kind of very provocative, it's a single authored book, but nonetheless, he stages a debate between himself and various other artists. And the title itself suggests there's multiplicity of perspectives. And also it's designed in a very interesting way. So I would like you to talk a little bit about why publishing is important and why the book as a form of debate making, as a forum for staging debate is important to you. And second, and this is a question I think I was coming up on the first segment, but I'll pose it now. Why do you write? What is it about writing that let's say you cannot do in something else, or let's forget it as something that in opposition to something else, but writing gives you something. And I'm very curious why you write as an artist. And your voice is very distinct. I've read all of your essays. I have read your website. Yeah. So I'd like to know about those two things.
Okay, they're really generous questions. I'm blushing with embarrassment that you're even associating what I do with what John Berger did with Ways of Seeing. Of course, it's in a way, it's not just a predecessor, it's a seminal book. And
it's everyone in India has to deal with this book.
Yeah, everyone
in art school.
Yeah, I think it's not just everyone in a Western capitalist society has to deal with this book, because Berger was a Marxist, so it's relevant in Russia as well, and China. So I think it's a universally relevant book. I read it, as part of my art history training at art school, but probably at foundation level or the year after. And in fact, the TV series, there were only 3 episodes of it, but this book has been in print constantly since the day of first publication to today. So if I walk into the Serpentine Gallery bookshop right now after this presentation, I know that book will be next to the till in a prominent place because it sells that well. And I can link my love of this book and Berger perhaps with your second question. I've just thought of quite a neat bridge.
Wonderful.
My favorite Berger book might surprise you. It's a little pamphlet called Why We Look at Animals. And at the beginning, the first chapter of that book is it's a kind of critical and analytical, deeply observed, heartfelt text about him catching a mouse in a trap and observing it and then taking it to a field up the road to dispose of it, let it free. And this happening 2 or 3 times. And it's, as a polymath, Berger is one of my heroes, as you know, because I think his poetry is often as good as his critical writing and his television programs and documentaries that he's made. So the link to my own writing is through a poetic way of writing, or beauty, if you like. It's not a fashionable word perhaps, but to allow that sort of poetry or idealism, humanity, definitely, humanism for sure, into intellectual life, you know, into smart thinking. And I think so that's what I try to do with my writing, is because I love poetry. I think poetry and music are probably the highest forms of art, and they certainly move me. And when you read certain poems, you know, you can be reborn by a poem. You know, it's so transformative. And to be honest, I didn't think I could write. You know, one of the reasons I did the PhD was to actually force myself to work out how to do it in a way where I felt that my authentic voice was there, you know, was the dominant characteristic, that I was articulating ideas, but with a voice that was genuine, and not assumed. Yeah.
And I would like you to just, that other bit, why write? What does writing do vis-a-vis the other things you do?
Yeah, well, writing is sculpture. You know, it's carving and modeling. So
Crafting thought.
Yes, exactly, and modeling thought. Yeah,
Yes.
Look at us. We were born to be together. Writing is crafting and modeling thought. It's exactly that. So, and it's the same with sculpture or painting, or when I'm composing sound. It's exactly the same process. It's just that the material with writing is words, but the process for me is exactly the same.
Shall we move on to the next one?
So these are, we're going
I just want to say something. This specialism book is so fantastic. I love this book because I have often taught in India. There are few art history programs that are there. Most of them are within art schools. And so I've always been fascinated by being on the fringes of this debate about how much is multidisciplinarity or focus or all these different things important, and what's the value, or and I love this book because it starts with the premise that now people have to live very precarious lives, and artists especially. I think I read a statistic that 2% of graduating students from art schools are actually practicing artists in India, in terms of professional artists who work in galleries and show in galleries. So what is the point of specializing? And then there's a lot of conversation. And this is something really important to me because in many ways, I like specializing, but specializing so that I can be in a space where I approach with that specialist mentality many different things. It sounds like a little bit contradictory, but I think this series in a sense represents that. Like I'm really interested in specializing in the idea of crafting thought. So where does specializing begin? Is it, as some people say in this book, with the focus on printmaking or sculpture or this, or shall we locate specializing in an approach to how we do things? So I love this book for that. We can continue, and these questions will come up as we talk.
Well, I hadn't had this thought before, actually, but you've inspired it. There's a paradox at the heart of this question, which is, in order for me to publish a book and make a career as a cross or interdisciplinarian, I had to become a specialist in the subject.
Right.
So
absolutely.
yeah, so And I also, the other thought I
It's like
had,
you go to a mini university, you do a bachelor's or a master's in every subject in order to do it.
yeah, so in a way, interdisciplinarity is my specialism. And the danger is that if you give it a name, it kills the spirit of what you intended it to be. So we have to be very careful about naming, because names become contracts, so hopefully this book is posited at a level where it's kept open enough still for interpretation and it doesn't become didactic. So it operates in the way that all the others do. We've got some people who follow a single path and other people who have reinvented themselves every other week. And that interests me in this current time because, as you pointed out quite rightly, it's very hard to make, it's taken me to get to this age now where I make my way in the world as an artist, but what an artist does is not what an artist did in Monet's day or even Rembrandt's day. You have to do a lot of things. You have to diversify. It's a good idea to spread your bets. The art world's a very sociable place, so it's a good idea to curate some shows as well it's for karmic reasons, to be invited back further down the line, in other people's shows.
Prestation.
Yeah, give and take. So it's a broad, it's a generous, slightly idealistic view of a subject that inevitably will never have a single answer, but it's good fun, as you say, to raise the questions. So that's what I did. You said something quite interesting about the introduction to the book, or some the thoughts left me for now, but I might come back to it in a minute.
Okay.
Yeah. And then this one I've talked about already a little bit. This came from a colleague of mine in Melbourne in Australia who knew about our work, and I knew he was doing good teaching. And he proposed that we do a book together about artist books, or where is the artist book now? And in the past, I published quite a lot of work on that subject, and I didn't feel like I was an expert in that field anymore. Basically, the work I did and the research I did in this area was in an era of the analog era. And so I thought immediately, if we're going to do a book about artists publishing today, it's going to be largely about the digital sphere, because people are doing such interesting work by making MP3 files as opposed to 3,000 word printed, manifestos. So I counter proposed that we do something about the act of distribution, how books circulate, how people meet their audience, and maybe how that mechanism of broadcasting and dissemination was actually a space and an energy that could be thought of in quite a creative and positive way. So in our usual spirit of adventure, we invited lots of people to write about that from a number of different perspectives, from a psychoanalysis perspective, an art perspective, design. It just came down to who I could get hold of, who was available, and who would say yes to participating, as it often does. Yeah. And then maybe I think you've got a slide coming up after this, maybe, of the Mad Major. I can't remember, but Shall we see? Oh, no, you haven't. Would you like me to talk about my chapter in this book now?
Not yet, not yet.
Not
Not
yet.
yet.
Okay. Okay, so we'll move on to another text, another bedtime story, because it's getting late. This is a photograph of the choir that the jazz musician Alice Coltrane established at her ashram in California. This concert was in America, but the text I'm going to read you is about a concert by the same group in London. It's called The Ecstatic Music of Alice Coltrane, and the concert was in 2017. Originally only made available on cassette tapes through the Sai Anatnam Ashram in Santa Monica, the devotional music of Alice Coltrane is her most obscure body of work. For decades after its release, this deeply personal catalogue of gospel, bhajan, blues fusion has been little known to jazz aficionados, let alone the wider public. All that is about to change. On a wet November evening, the Sai Natanam Ashram singers present their multi-generational and multi-ethnic hybrid brand of devotional music to a London audience for the first time. The tone of the event, hosted by St. Luke's Church, is preordained by a number of do and don't rules. Attendees are instructed to wear comfortable clothing covering your knees and shoulders, and to be wary of other people's enjoyment of the show. We're invited to stay for complimentary vegetarian food after the show and to chant and sing along, if we feel like it. Sadly, in response to this last directive, most people don't. The problem is that the choir just can't recreate the ambience of blissful contemplation that Alice mesmerized her following with back in sunny LA. Not their fault entirely, that's for sure. The setting and the weather don't help, but moreover, a sense that London audiences just don't like being told what to do and how to feel is an enormous elephant in the room. Despite a valiant effort by the dozen or so male and female singers, including John and Alice Coltrane's daughter, Michelle, awkwardness, not ecstasy, is the prevailing atmosphere. On the upside, the little plates of dal and chapati served in the basement afterwards are authentic and utterly delicious. Several members of the choir come down to mingle with the crowd. In this less formal environment, sharing food and memories of India, full participation is finally achieved. At long last, this impromptu gathering provides a worthy call and response framework from within which the forecast tone of joy is more likely realized. So we're going to talk about sound a little bit now. In my teaching career, I've had a couple of occasions where I've been sitting with a student. They're showing me their work and it's okay, but the student's more interesting than what they're showing to me. And you sort of think, you've got such an interesting mind, you know, why is your painting so prosaic? you wouldn't ever ask that question directly. So on occasion, I've politely asked, do you do anything else? You know, what do you do in your spare time? And quite often people confess that they're in a band or that they make tape recordings and mix them themselves and just share them with friends. Or nowadays it would be, you know, working digitally as a producer, you know, making dance music or whatever. One guy, I won't get into details because these people will know who I'm referring to. But when you give someone license to follow their true passion and just suggest that maybe you could make that your work, and just get your degree using a guitar instead of a paintbrush, the scales fall from their eyes and their minds open up, and a transformation can take place. And after a few times of offering that advice, I got challenged myself in the same way, because I collect music and I've always taken listening to music very seriously, and I've DJ'd and always enjoyed playing music at parties, at gigs. Someone said, make a sound work for my label, this cassette label. And I just agreed to do it, in the spirit that my students had sometimes agreed to take the challenge, my provocative challenge to them. So I just went away and found out how to do it. So I got in touch with an ex-student who had become a sound artist, who's a good friend of mine called Tom White, who I still work with today. And he gave me some rudimentary instruction in microphones and digital recording. And then I thought, well, I'm not trained as a musician at all. I don't know what to do, but I know I've got a voice, and I actually don't like the sound of my own voice whenever I hear it recorded. So it would be an extra interesting challenge to make a serious sound work with my own voice. So I kept it as simple as possible. And this piece of work on the A side, it's just me repeating the word okay. And then on the B side, hoping that it will be, I get 9 people, including myself, to repeat the word okay. And then in the studio, I arrange these recordings so they become not a form of music, but an element of musicality enters into what you're hearing. And the idea started in India, actually, because the OK brand, as you know, it's like a generic brand that you see everywhere for soap and whatnot. And on the backs of truck, mud flaps and horn OK, please. So typographically, I was really interested in this, but in connection to the OM. So the idea of a more accessible, not accessible, but a more achievable target than the actual OM, that okay, just to be okay, is actually, could be quite a practical mantra for the difficult times that we're living through. So they kind of, this piece of work, it's kind of feels like a mantra. It's also a bit like conceptual art. It kind of has a foot, 3 or 4 feet in different puddles of history. But I was very happy doing this work. And since then I've worked with sound a lot. So this last month, I've just been working with sound exclusively for projects, exhibitions and releases all over the world. And I've, as you'll see later, I've just come back from Helsinki, where I did a live sound performance with a wonderful Finnish sound artist. So this was my first one. And then the other thing that I'm more fearful of than the sound of my own voice recorded is the prospect of performing live, which terrifies me, because I'm not very good at tech stuff, and most sound artists seem to have boxes plugged in everywhere with wires coming out of them and going to other places that I have no idea about. So my live sound work is much more from my own DJing tradition. So I just mix things that I've already made. But this was a therapeutic project that's had many iterations. This one's the poster for a fantastic gallery in New York called P, exclamation mark, that was run by a really exciting curator called Prem Krishnamurti, that your design students should check out his back catalogue and the projects he put on at P. And basically, I just invite people to not be busy, for an hour, to relax and let me send them off to sleep if necessary, or just chill out a bit. This one was a bit more advanced because we did an hour of buzzing yoga with a yoga practitioner before I came on for my hour. And at the end of it, you have to wake people up. They just go somewhere else. So I guess it's, if I wanted to be a mystical confidence trickster, I've learnt, how those guys get away with it in India. It's not as difficult as you'd imagine. If you invite people to just, and you've got something worthwhile to listen to. So they're all field recordings that I work with, and they're quite often from nature or from urban environments. And each piece that I make has a clear idea. Like the thing I've just made last week was just about my kitchen in the south of France. It's called Kitchen Composition. And it's just made out of things that I've recorded in that one space over a period of 3 or 4 years. Now I finally put them all together into a coherent form that happens to be quite contemplative and minimal. And aesthetically, it's similar to all the other work that I make. And then we're in the middle of renaming this website, which is where I publish. This website functions a bit like the Open Editions anthologies in the occasional table series we've been talking about. So the idea is that I support a small group of visual artists that also work with sound. And I want to offer them a space to publish their work over a longer period, so I'm hoping this could last 10 years or so, and everyone has their own channel and we just do them as and when, but we're changing the name from British Airways to Continuous Tone. Continuous Tone's the name of the record label I run, so we want to integrate those things. So if anyone is interested in glitchy, wonky, ambient, collagey sound art, there's hours and hours of listening pleasure for you on this website, britishairways.com. So maybe, do you have any sonic inquiries, or should we skip to the next?
We will skip to the next one.
Okay, I think this section's about my relationship with India. The title of this photograph is Red Carpet, and it was taken in Bombay in 2020. Revenues from Caddy Industries in the last financial year stand at £50 million sterling, a statistic that makes it all the more surprising to note that their stores are always pleasantly run down. At this branch, which is nearby the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj terminus, to enter is to step back in time. Courteous staff members in uniform guide you through an antiquated procurement process involving handwritten dockets, tokens, rubber stamps, brown paper parcels, staples, and yards of string. One of the most alluring aspects of life in India is that it takes place in warped space and time. Uniquely, here it's possible to have temporal experiences that vacillate between the centuries. In the countryside, for example, it's commonplace to see farmers ploughing fields using medieval bullock carts while chatting on their mobile phones. And walking the downtown streets of Bombay is so much like being in a science fiction film set in a globally warmed London future where familiar Victorian architecture has been overtaken by a contradictory mix of software programmers, fake fashion brands, the dispossessed and up-and-coming Bollywood bourgeoisie. Striding down the grand stairway of this national institution, I sense the thousands of people who have descended before me, their leather chapels shuffling, boots creaking, and bare feet slipping on the carpet in polyrhythmic counterpoint to my own flip-flopping. So I first came to India in 1986 on a flight that cost me £27 because it was a courier flight. So you could get these cheap tickets if you carried an envelope of important documents. And hence that how I was able to come in the first place. And I've come back every year once, or sometimes even more than once. And gradually, my life in India has, well, pretty quickly, it stopped being tourism and became a research project, I suppose. But I've found it quite hard to find connections with public institutions in India with which to share my work or to make collaborations with, have shows with, or whatever. Back in the 80s even, it was even quite difficult to find if there was a subculture in India at all. It seemed to be the art world was still dominated by, the big guys from the modernist era. So one of the very first projects I did there independently was called Knowing Where to Stop, and I staged it at the Regal Cinema in Colaba, which is an Art Deco 1930s cinema, which is under threat of closure. It may even have lost its battle to stay open. I'm not sure. Maybe someone can let me know.
It's open. It's open.
It's still open, okay. And I was in there watching a movie one evening, and I was taken by the fact that before the film and in the intermission, someone in the projection booth switched on a slide projector and projected these 2¼ inch square slides to advertise local companies, local businesses near the cinema, like the Sari Emporium or the Air India office, for example. And I took a note of the advertising agency's name because I thought, well, okay, if they have a capacity of 1,000 people at this cinema and there are 4 performances a day, I could maybe rent advertising space next month in the middle of whatever film they're showing. And more people would see my work than if I had 10 solo shows in the next year. So that was, okay, we'll be back to distribution, aren't we? Okay.
Yes, we are.
Yes, so I'd been photographing for many years vehicles in India that had been repaired for rust and damage and painted with this protective non-rust paint, but not resprayed. So these cars and rickshaws and buses, they looked like the kind of paintings I would like to have made, but didn't have to bother now because I could just photograph these paintings that had been made unwittingly by people who were just mechanically or not consciously doing a job of work. And I also really like the idea that the cinema was a place where images of the rest of the world, mostly America, of lifestyles and levels of wealth and aspirations were being presented that were completely out of out of reach, even for me, let alone local people. And I'm always very interested in elevating simple materials to a higher level, or discovering the poetry, or monumentalizing modest materials. So I just showed images of these in the cinema, and I left a stack of cards at the office so that all my adoring fans would know how to contact me and offer me exhibitions from the local up-and-coming Karla Goda art district, and I had no replies whatsoever. It wasn't such a sad story with this project. I love Chor Bazaar in Bombay. Everyone knows me there. I know everyone, and I drink so much chai and thumbs up just walking down that road, because I get offered so much hospitality. You almost can't move by the time you get to the end of the road. But one of the first people I met there was this guy, Mr. Mansoori, who runs a shop that had started selling Indian movie posters. And they were peanuts, they were, and when he started showing them to me, I just couldn't believe what I was looking at, because it's like anyone from England visiting India. There's this strange mixture of familiarity because of the historical colonial past and the architecture and mannerisms, the language. But the way that that's all been twisted and remixed and appropriated is absolutely fascinating to me. So formally, like the Kilari exhibition poster on the bottom right, this is very similar, kind of imagery that you would get from, 1940s, 1930s American action films or melodramas. But the detail in there is quite odd. You've got this actress, Fearless Nadia, who's white and from Finland. And then you've got this, I don't know who's starring in this, maybe, but he's got this Dilip Kumar kind of hair, floppy haircut. And then you've got like a Bond girl. And this one's quite decipherable to me. This one I like mostly because of the typography, but there are others. There's one we got where there's a guy holding his own eyeballs in his hands out at you, and there are images of gods, and this is for a devotional movie, and I'm thinking, my God, this is so alien. I've got to, even though I don't necessarily like this aesthetic, I'm really interested in what it means and how this one format could be used as a lens through which you look at a more wider Indian cultural identity. So I knew immediately I was completely unqualified to do that work on my own. So I just took on, as Annapurna previously mentioned, the responsibility, A, to make sure that everything was contextualized. So there are photographs of everyday street scenes interspersed with the gallery presentations of the posters. B, that I got hold of the best possible visual anthropologists and design writers that I could, to write seriously about the work from their own perspective. And C, to treat the subject not only as nationally, so we mixed North and South India, therefore challenging the Bollywood hierarchy a little bit, but we got the best designers I knew in London, who's probably still our graphic thought facility, to design a book that treated this subject matter that most people were throwing away or recycling or burning to the level of art. And it sold quite quickly, actually. It sold out quite quickly. And I think because I've been involved a little bit in the visual anthropology scene in India, where you've got such a better and developed culture for writing intelligently about popular culture than we do in the UK. It's admirable, the work that's going on in India. I've presented papers and done lectures a few times for people there. So I've become aware that this actually was a bit of an inspiration. And I get the feeling sometimes that younger, there wasn't really an attitude where you could look at your own past maybe and enjoy the pleasure of trash, you know, and take pleasure in looking at things that were lowly in the way that I'm interested in doing. So now I can go out in the same area. I'm sure someone could name 5 cafes in Karlagoda right now that has decorated the whole places, you know, in this style of B movie or C grade even aesthetic. So it was one of the first, and I'm very proud of that. But I'm also quite proud of the fact that I didn't admit that I was an expert, that I was just an enthusiast. We've talked about that. I think we should probably soldier on.
Yes, we should soldier on.
Yeah, we've got 2 more and they'll be quite quick, I think. This is a photograph of the artist Yves Klein, and it's called Leap into the Void, and it was made in 1960. In October 1960, Yves Klein hired photographers to make a series of pictures of him jumping off a rooftop. The location was in the Paris suburb of Fontenay-aux-Roses. On the street below, a group of the artist's friends held a tarpaulin to catch him as he fell. 2 negatives, one with the safety net and one without, were then printed together to create the impression that the artist was able to fly. Why is it that we can't help hoping, even in full knowledge that the image is contrived, that he succeeded? Obviously, the photograph is incredibly convincing. It's impossible to detect the mask. Plus, the artist is self-evidently airborne, and unlike Superman, whose quiff and skin-tight tunic remain motionless as he flies, fronds of his hair flutter in the wind and waves ripple across his trouser legs. But more importantly, Klein's gaze is heavenward. His focus is on the beyond. He anticipates gliding the current across the street before thrusting over the neighbouring gardens towards the railway line, and then on to buy cigarettes at the Old Tabac on the Avenue Marshal Foch. Over to you.
Well, I chose this from your book Distributed because of the beautiful passage about this man that you grew up watching as a child in your neighborhood, who in a way was flying like Yves Klein, I suppose. He lived this improbably but completely real life on the street and performing and dressed in this this very kind of unreal elegance on the street. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about memory and nostalgia, and if how you fashioned yourself in a way, like Yves Klein imagined himself into doing something that perhaps he wanted to do, and perhaps many of us want to do. So these kinds of things that you saw as a young person, how did they contribute to self-fashioning?
Yeah. Well, this chapter I wrote, there were 3 vignettes of 3. The one that you can see called Spread Love was actually about Amma, a visit to her ashram.
Yes.
So the three subjects I chose were subjects where something was being given away for nothing. So my chapters sort of
for anybody who doesn't know, he's talking about Mata Amritanandamani in Kerala.
Yeah. and worldwide, of course. So my chapters are about gift economy. And so one of the examples was an artist who sort of gave his work away, or he used his work as a prop to start a conversation. And the conversation was the work that was given away for nothing. Amma spreads cosmic energy through the medium of the action of the hug. So when she hugs you, she's transmitting cosmetic. It's not cosmetic. Some people think cosmetic, but cosmic energy. And I had quite a profound experience receiving a hug from Amma, although she has her critics. And Horace Duke was just a guy who used to dress up as a very wealthy, old money guy who and stand at our local roundabouts to exhibit himself to passing traffic. So his image was the thing that he was giving away. And I guess, I mean, my base interest here was in the gift economy and about doing something without payment, or to sort of raise questions about labour and payment in generally, but in the art world particularly, because quite often I work for free. Sometimes you get paid quite well, and often you do it for the love. So you have to believe in something higher than the evidence that's in front of you a lot of the time in the art world. And I think Horace Duke, he was a cleaner. He had he was, you know, the equivalent of a rag picker in India. He had a lowly job in a factory, not even a big factory. His job was just to keep the factory floor swept. But all his money he spent in Savile Row buying these clothes and putting on this performance. And it was just part of our lives in those days. You would know when summer was starting because he wouldn't do it in the winter. So as soon as the weather turned, Horace would be there. And it was kind of creepy and kind of theatrical in an English kind of surrealist way. So there were lots of levels to this. But largely it was to do with just wanting to be recognized, you know. So that's why I was interested in that. And then I actually think Yves Klein can fly. You know, so I think you've got to believe in some of these. You've got to take a leap of faith. Yeah, okay. And so much of what we do in the art world, if no one's asking you to do anything, or you're trying something for the first time, or you're trying to get a new project off the ground, and there's no funding and no critics offering to write about it, it's a leap of faith. And so there's a lesson, I think, to be learned in each of these three examples about how you can, in a Gandhian way, be the future that you want to see.
Wonderful. And then the last one?
Yeah, we're on the sections about performance. So I think we can skip through this quite quickly because we're approaching the intermission where I'm going to show you some slides of cars. No, we're approaching the end. Don't worry, we're nearly there. Another yoga project with a gallery in Hamburg where some amazing artists were invited to just make an installation. I was inspired by the back wall on the left of this image, which was almost entirely glass. So it was very impressive, the amount of light that flooded into the space. So when you're offered an opportunity like this, you have to find something that you find interesting, either contextually or intellectually, to give you traction that will enable you to come up with a coherent idea. So I alighted upon this idea of just filling the space with avocados, because they take time between being harvested and eaten to ripen in the warmth of light. So I like the idea of these yoga practitioners having to share their space with something in its infancy that would mature. Each fruit had its own character and colour as well. I really like that bit of time. The show was called Small Time. So that bit of time between buying them in the market and then being ready for these guys to eat as a superfood at the end of their sessions, that was the idea. And then, of course, there's a scatter element to this, which we'll be talking about in a second.
I put this in partly in continuing this conversation of doing work in public in different ways. With Kenneth Clark on one side in Britain, talking about classicism, and I like the quote that was from the New Yorker that talks about his series Civilization, which aired on BBC. Scholars and academics had their understandable quibbles, but for the general public, the series was something like a revelation. Art museum exhibits in both England and the US reported a surge of visitors following each episode. And then when we think to John Berger and his series, we shall also discover something about ourselves and the situation in which we're living. And then we take a quote of his: the human imagination has great difficulty in living strictly within the confines of a materialist practice or philosophy. It dreams like a dog in the basket of hares in the open. So is that idea, so in a way, so much of your work, and I say this because I'm also a bit like you, I'm an idealist, and you too have spoken about the word idealism. And we also think about livelihood. What is the role of gifting, and what is the role of thinking about our own livelihoods and the livelihoods of other people that come to be in our orbit? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a constant struggle. When an artist becomes too successful, they become a kind of slave to their own destiny. You know, once there's a market, the representatives who look after you, they can't get enough of it. So it's very hard to dream like a dog in a basket. You know, you end up operating more like Henry Moore, who Kenneth Clark has spoken about. There was even a pop song in the charts, I remember, titled "Don't Do Any More, Henry Moore," because everyone was sick of it. He just did too many. And so I've always been suspicious of artists who are prolific, like Picasso and Henry Moore. And I think the market has marketization, often with their own blessing, or if not at their own hand. Picasso was very aware and clever about how he used his own brand, his own image, to brand his work and marketize it. I'm not so comfortable with that. And I just remember Kenneth Clark feeling like a leftover from the Second World War or something. He didn't speak to me in a language that I understood when I was 12 years old or whatever it was, when that program was on. Whereas John Berger had long hair and enormous collars on his shirt, you know, and he was able to talk about adverts that were current, you know, that we could see at the train station for whiskey, you know, in the same breath that he would talk about a classical painting. So I know which side of your divide there I'd be on. I find Berger's view of the world much more interesting, because generally I'm more interested in questions than answers, you know, and I've never really wanted to make a statement or to own, you know, to coin a term or have intellectual copyright over anything. I'm more comfortable in letting it be more like music for people to remix or quote from. Yeah. So yeah, maybe Berger's more like music and Kenneth Clark's more like sculpture. It's fixed and permanent and immovable and heavy. Whereas,
and it gives confidence to ourselves.
Yeah, but also the market. I think
Yes.
there's market confidence, as you know.
Yes, I say that with a lot of irony.
Oh, yeah. Okay, noted. I mean, so we're in a section about performance. So this is a film, or action, we should say. So this is a film I made in a few years, 3 or 4 years ago, which I made as an artist. Again, it was unfunded. It was a leap of imagination. It's something I stumbled across. And it's basically this small rice flour producer in the middle of nowhere who had little money. And so their drying process, probably there are similar places in Bihar and maybe in Kerala, I've seen spice dried in a similar way, but not exactly the same as this. So they designed these tools for raking, throwing the rice grain on the floor, and then this other tool in Konkani, it's called dato, which I presume relates to teeth, where they drag this tool to create these furrows to dry the steamed rice husks in the sun so that they can be milled off to take the impurities out. And it just seemed like an incredible environment. It felt like it was a subject that was so important. I just felt absolutely obligated to do something with it. And it just happened that I was an artist. I think if anyone else had come along, they could have done it from another perspective. So basically, it's a whole day filmed in a 30-minute, edited down to a 30-minute film. But the thing in hindsight, a bit like the book I did in India that's proved to be of interest to me, is who's appreciated it and who hasn't. It's sort of largely escaped the art world to my surprise. I made it as an artist and I sort of expected to be showing it a lot in art galleries, but I've only shown it at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London, and all the other, it's being screened yesterday in Paris. No, the day before yesterday at an ethnographic film festival. The anthropology world's taken it up. It was shown at the Workers Unite Film Festival in New York, and it won a prize in Rome at an agricultural film festival. And then, to my surprise, 2 Greek academics contacted me and wanted to write a peer-reviewed academic essay about the film, but from the perspective of mathematics and classical Greek philosophy, which I found so interesting. That, again, like with music, the fact that you can make something and there's kind of, everyone's got permission to carry it somewhere else if they want to. Unlike Henry Moore, I'm more comfortable with that. So for a while I was a little disappointed that it didn't get more art gallery screenings. It might happen in the future, of course, but delighted at the same time that these other audiences and these other enthusiasts found their way of contacting me to show their appreciation and share it in their spheres of study or distribution. So that's been great. And we're on to the final text. and then we can end the session. This is a painting by René Magritte, the French surrealist. There are 12 versions of it. I guess for economic reasons, a lot of artists at the turn of that century, George de Chirico being the most notable, for just copying their own work and selling it on and on, because that was one way of making a living. This version's in the collection of MoMA in New York, and it's my favorite of the 12. It's called Empire of Light, and it's number 2 in the series, and it was painted in 1950. In this painting, a nocturnal street scene stands in the shadow of a midday sky. Fluffy white clouds, straight out of The Simpsons, hang motionlessly in a cornflower haze, while simultaneously, on the darkness of the cobblestones, it's easy to imagine the quietness being shattered by the sound of a dustbin lid tipped over by a stray cat. Ingeniously, any confusion that such a cosmic abnormality would stir in the viewer's mind is alleviated by the certainty with which the picture is being made. Magritte's representational conservatism emboldens the idea of daytime at night to the point at which it becomes plausible. Neat brushwork and matter-of-fact romanticism give the disorderliness of this vision an air of normalcy. In mischievous René's world, the stranger is revealed to be a friend. And I'm just going to speak very quickly about painting. It's not something I ever thought I'd be doing, oddly, but I've ended up enjoying making paintings recently and hope to continue to do so. But the way I found my way to it has been through installation or performance, because the film Rice I just regard as a painting that changes. You know, these guys have designed a system and it's almost like a ritual performance they're doing. But of course, the image, the abstract image, it's so amazing, the shapes that they're making, the cloud burst, the geometry, and the way that the material is solid and liquid simultaneously. It's staggering. So this is a canvas leant against the wall, and on it is projected a galaxy, and the galaxy is made by reading one of Stephen Hawking's academic texts called The Large Scale Structure of Space-Time, which is a book about quantum physics, where he's trying to prove, I think from memory, the existence of wormholes. And it was published at a time where neo-conceptualism and conceptual physics were emerging simultaneously in social life as areas of innovation in intellectual life. So I tried to read the book as a non-academic, and I found it impenetrable, shall we say. So what I decided to do was, at the end of every sentence, I'd make a pinhole in the full stop that went through the page and through a piece of paper, blank piece of paper. And so this is the whole book read by me, projected back onto the wall, but in a form that feels honest about my reading. So it's my embodiment of his knowledge, if you like. So that's that one. And the show that I've got on at the moment is with Lau Now, Laura, who's a sound artist in Finland, and Paul O'Neill, the editor who I published and mentioned earlier, runs this space called Publix, and he's initiated this series of projects where he brings people together under this banner coupling, and we decided, he proposed some other painters because he wanted to show some of my recent paintings, but I preferred to do something that didn't complement exactly what I was doing or echo what I was doing. I wanted something to disrupt it or undermine it or take it into another dimension. And I'd listened to all of Laura's work and liked it very much and thought she would be the kind of person who'd be up for such a collaboration. She agreed to do it, and it opened 2 weeks ago. So this is she and I, coupling, literally. And you might have a comment before I show the paintings, and then we're at the end of the presentation.
Well, I actually would, let me just set this aside for a minute. I'm actually interested in, can you go back to the previous image? I'm actually interested in asking you, do you think as a man, when you work, do you think about your gender as a man?
What kind of man do you think I am?
I have no idea. I haven't met you enough. I think you're a fun person.
Yeah.
Maybe you are very comfortable with women and comfortable with other people in general. And I think you're used to being comfortable with provoking people and receiving provocation back, and enjoy that kind of give and take. But I really like this image because I think when we take the word coupling and we see these two colors slightly off, maybe they're three colors off center, in some sense, they're not evenly placed, and there's the two of you sort of centering yourself in this image, and she's looking a little askance, like what's happening here. And I see you very centered and looking right at the camera. And I'm thinking a little bit about you as a man, and as the kind of a kind of confidence that a gendered practice allows, that's based on sort of, I don't have all these words set in place, but something like a flexibility, like you could be maybe a mothery kind of figure or a midwife figure as you positioned yourself. You could be a white guy in India, and learning words like dato and those sort of things. So in a way, I want to conclude by asking you this question. It's more important than the other slide that you showed.
Okay.
It's more important, I think, to really say, how do you make yourself hold on to your primary identity as a man? You were born as a male child in this world, I think. And then you figure out a way to keep moving with that and out of it and back into it, and make that part of your practice. I think that's something like my question. If I had more time to think about it, it would be more polished, but it's not, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Do you know what? I knew you were going to ask something like this.
Yes, I'm sure you did.
And I knew you would try and disarm me with that smile of yours. But I'm going to sidestep it slightly, because I don't really identify as a man in the way that you're talking about. I don't think that way. I'm like everyone, a complicated person, and that complexity and being open about that. So to be weak and strong, to be female or male, to be caring, to be the boss if you have to, all these things, any kind of cliche you could attribute to masculinity, they're just boundaries to be challenged and played with. So the way I will answer this question is to describe a lecture I gave recently, or prepared recently, but I couldn't give it in the end. I think either I got COVID or I got ill or something. But this, I was meant to give some students a presentation about how to describe themselves, graduating and going out into the world, you know, so what to say about themselves in the way that you're asking me to say about myself. And the title of the lecture was Prefer Not to Say. And the title's an appropriation of a line of text you always get whenever you apply for a passport or to see a doctor or anything official with the government or applying for a teaching job. They ask you all these questions about your sexual orientation and your religion, and I prefer not to say.
That's fine. That's fine. Please show us your paintings.
Oh, okay, and then it's game over. So, yep, they're abstract. They're made out of stretcher wedges. So again, it's a very humble unit, like a rice grain, maybe. And they're not meant to be seen because they're behind the stretcher bars, locking them in to make the canvas square. And I just got interested in them as a lowly material that could be looked at and distributed in different ways, that were kind of wild on one hand, but kind of edging towards a more schematic approach in another way. And so some of them, they're all based on particular locations or color schemes. So the one on the bottom left is from leaves in my street 2 autumns ago that were turning colour. The one on the right is from a hotel room I stayed in, in India, in Tamil Nadu. And the more recent one, the scatter piece was, they were all the colours related to old bricks and debris that were in the banks, the bottom of the River Thames. So when the tide goes out, on the banks of the river, you have all these units of rubbish that are interesting colours. They're like dirty greys and terracottas and yellows. So the colour scheme for that piece was based on the Thames. And the hotel was in Tiruvannamalai, and I know my Tamil's terrible. I should have said that 4 times faster for it to make any sense. And it's called the Hotel Nala Residency, and I'd recommend it. It's brilliant. That's me and Paul in the show. And sorry, that was the longest presentation I've ever given, I think. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Would you like me to stop sharing my screen now?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah.
I encourage the audience to ask any questions. We have a few minutes. The Kiran Nadar staff is patient. So if you have any questions, please do ask. Otherwise, I know you can write to David at his website.
Yeah.
And he will answer you back.
I will.
I love those paintings. They remind me of Carmen Herrera. And she's an artist that I've discovered very late. And it's a kind of abstraction that is oddly emotional.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, she died very recently, and she only got discovered when she was 80 years old or something.
Yeah.
Spatially, they're extraordinary, you know, when it's like Ellsworth Kelly as well. If you see a show, a full installation of his work, something really mystical. There's something mystical in that work for me. So I love her as well.
I think that there's something beautiful about them because it requires a lot of patience to size things and put them together in that way. And whenever you are called to be patient, it is quite transformative in in the doing. The doing is quite transformative. It whatever the outcome, the doing has a kind of elevating quality to it, and I do find that very emotional. So it's the way I respond to that work.
The other little secret guiding hand is something we've discussed before as well. It's the beginner's mind theory.
Yes.
Suzuki's. There's a lovely anecdote in the chapter about control, which says something like the best way to control your cow or your sheep is to feed it well and give it plenty of room. And then in the same chapter, he describes an ancient Buddhist game that artists used to play. It's like a challenge to try and draw a series of dots on a blank piece of paper in a way that demonstrated they had no connection. There was no system, no plan, no desire, no ambition. And so with these paintings, I'm really playing with that idea of order and chaos being part of the same harmony, about setting up shapes within them that look as though they're comforting in terms of a pattern, but then undermining that as much as possible so that it goes crazy within the same frame, so that it doesn't add up, but it conveys the kind of confidence that encourages the viewer to feel that you're in safe pair of hands, maybe. Yeah, so those Buddhist ideas about seeing something for the first time, about filming something that just seems to have happened by itself, or scattering something, or organizing something in a schematic way with a very weird or invisible logic or no logic. You know, that's structurally, I'm interested in those things.
So I don't see anybody having questions, and I thank whoever's remained for this entire presentation, for your incredible patience and commitment to listening to both of us talk to each other about the way David crafts his work and his thought. As a conclusion, I want to say that I think it's part of the freedom of getting older. It's the gift of getting older. I'm 55. You must be somewhere around there. Yes, and it's a freedom that you gain from, I think, in the best of all worlds, getting older is a kind of freedom. A freedom to think deeply and meaningfully and generously. Thank you so much for being with me and everyone else today.
It's a lovely thought to end on. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Okay. I hope to speak to you soon. And thanks to all the team behind today's event. I know there's been a lot of work gone in.
Thank you so much to everyone.
So thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.